and then the chest rose and dropped like a breathing motion. And it turns out she wasn't dead. This body that smelled like decomposition, that they immediately thought was a corpse, breathed. One of the missing persons officers, Norelle Fraser, actually got into the boot with Maria and held her until officers got there so that she wasn't alone, because she felt so bad about the fact that this woman had been alive in this boot for all of this time. Maria was immediately rushed to the nearby Alfred Hospital in a critical condition. She was unconscious, she was unresponsive, and it was a shock to both police and medical staff that she was even alive after the intense trauma that her body had been through. They immediately put her into an induced coma to allow medical staff to start treating her extensive injuries without putting her body through any more strain. But the extent of her injuries were devastating. She was severely dehydrated. Her heart was so weak that it was barely pushing blood through her arteries. Her blood pressure was so low that her blood vessels weren't even visible anymore. She had brain swelling, her flesh had patches of black dead skin, blood clots and ulcers were caused by a lack of mobility that formed throughout her body. There was a distinctive ligature mark around her neck, her eyes were bloodshot and enlarged, and judging by the progression of the injuries, it was determined that she had been unconscious in the boot of the car for the duration of her disappearance, so just over 4 days or 102 hours. Due to the ligature marks around her neck, her bloodshot eyes, it was determined that she had been strangled. There was an abrasion on the right side of her scalp, as well as a scar on the right side of her forehead and a scab on the front of her nose, which indicated that there had been some sort of struggle with her attacker before they strangled her. It appeared as though she had fallen or was pushed into a hard surface like concrete. It was clear that the person who had done this was inexperienced, that they had intended to kill her, and that when she fell unconscious due to the strangulation, they had mistaken that for her death. So obviously it was clear that there was somebody out there who wanted Maria dead, and so there were police guards posted in her hospital room. At 3 p.m, detectives headed to Joe's house to tell him, and he was ecstatic that she was alive. He was grateful to the officers for telling him. He wanted to go and see her. However, Maria's chance of survival was only at 25%. And police were really hoping that she would pull through so that they could get justice for her, so that she could provide some sort of insight as to what could have happened to her. They didn't want to take any chances. Joe was a suspect. They didn't want him to see her. They ended up reinstating Maria's original restraining order, preventing him from being within 200 meters of her. When Laura found out, she immediately went to visit her mother in hospital and was devastated about what had happened to her. And as soon as she got to the hospital and saw her mother, she noticed that there was something missing. Her crucifix necklace, her earrings, and her wedding ring were gone, which her wedding ring in particular, Laura had never seen her mother without that on. So for it to have been gone, someone would have had to take it off Maria forcibly. The jewelry wasn't in the car, it wasn't at the house, it was missing. The next day, on the 14th of February, a man named Steve Deacon entered the hospital to talk to police, and he was Tanya Herman's brother. He said he'd heard about the fact that Maria had been found and that he needed to tell police what he knew. He said he didn't know Maria, but he knew Joe, and he was not a fan, to say the least. Steve ended up telling the police about how much control Joe had over Tanya and about a few incidents that had happened within their relationship, like this one time that Joe just randomly started ghosting Tanya. He just stopped replying to her texts, her calls, and she became super depressed because of this and ended up attempting suicide. And then when Joe and Tanya ended up talking again, getting back together, Steve talked about the fact that the family was very vocal about how much they disliked him, about how they felt like Joe was trying to drive a wedge between the family and Tanya, which is, you know, a classic sign of an abusive, toxic relationship. There was this one time, and this is really cooked, in August of 2014, when he told Tanya that he was going to Barcelona to visit his mother who had had a heart attack, and then during this trip, his brother calls Tanya and tells Tanya that Joe died in a car accident in Barcelona. Tanya was devastated, so much so that she actually had to be hospitalized. She wouldn't leave the fetal position, she wouldn't eat, she wouldn't drink. She ended up writing a letter for Joe for his funeral, which I will get up now. The message read, "Joseph William Bronte, you came to me on the wings of an angel. My world was complete. We had dreams, hopes, a future together. Everything was perfect and planned. Joe, I love you with all of my heart and soul. Your sun shone upon me. Together we were going to grow, but your life was taken suddenly. I pray specially for you, my love, for you are the special one. I know God sent you to me. Somewhere you have wings, my darling angel. You are now where no one can hurt you. I won your heart for being myself. We were one, we were true soulmates." Then, a few days later, after she's written a note for his funeral, after she has been hospitalized because she's been so depressed about losing the love of her life, she gets a call from Joe, who says, "I'm not dead. I was in a car accident in Barcelona, but I'm not dead." He even went as far as to video chat her, show her all the scars that he had on him. But then when he came back to visit her, like a couple days after, he was scratch-free. And then, before his family or Tanya could even question him, he's asking her family for his blessing to marry her. I have no idea why he did that, but I wonder if he decided, oh, I'm gonna end things, I'm gonna stay with Maria, and then he like got his brother to pretend that he was dead, and then he was like, oh, actually, I do want to be with Tanya, and then like came back with her. Or I wonder if it was just like a controlling, completely manipulative thing to make her like want him more, because she's like, oh, he's actually not dead, thank God, I'm never gonna let him go, sort of thing. Steve also told the police another interesting piece of information. He told them that on the 9th of February, so the morning that Maria disappeared, before 9 a.m, Tanya showed up at his workplace, which was in the Melbourne CBD on Elizabeth Street. He worked in a motorcycle shop. She showed up in running wear, you know, leggings, hoodie, some runners. She was red and sweaty in the face, and she told him that she had had a job interview that morning and decided to go for a run into the city afterwards, and asked if he could give her a lift back to Greenvale. Like, he found it a little odd, but at the same time it wasn't that odd, because she had always been really fit her whole life. She loved to go for jogs, she loved to run, so it wasn't that out of the ordinary, but also, I don't know, it was kind of weird timing. He was like kind of weirded out by it, but at the same time he was like, oh, this could be something she's just doing right now. However, after everything came to light about Maria, he definitely felt like this was something shady, like he should tell police, especially considering the date that it happened. And he wasn't the only one with the information, because on the 15th of February at around 11 a.m, one of Tanya's daughter Taylor's school friends came in with some information as well. She said that one day while they were at school, Taylor had told all of her school friends that her mum and Joe murdered Maria and that there was blood in the garage because of it. She said that her mum was going to bury Maria at the Greenvale Reservoir Park, but didn't end up doing that. And she only told her friends, like, you know, she had this massive weight on her shoulders of this murder, and she needed to tell someone. She was like, please don't tell anyone, guys. But then, of course, her friend who ended up telling the police then had it on her shoulders and felt guilty as well, and ended up coming forward to the police. And it makes sense considering the way that the teacher said that Taylor was acting on the 9th of February when she was dropped off at school late that day, and she cried twice in class and, you know, was like clinging to her mum, didn't want her mum to leave. But at the same time, police, they were quick to pump the brakes, not go and arrest someone because of this statement, because, you know, she is a kid, she could be hearing things wrong, she could be making it up, especially because, you know, Maria's murder and the fact that she was strangled had been all over the news. So everybody knew about it and what had happened to her. And on top of that, when police questioned Taylor about it, she denied it. But of course, like, she's not going to dob her mum into the police. And like I said, this was all over the media. This was an absolutely massive case. There was a lot of drama involved, a murder, a mistress, you know, it was huge. People were interested, and there were media vans camped outside of Joe's place, camped outside of Tanya's place, and Joe, being this charming, persuasive, manipulative guy that he was, painted him out to be this mourning husband who, you know, had a mistake, and Tanya was painted to be this crazy girlfriend who was obsessed with Joe, and Joe said that he had nothing to do with Tanya, so he was just making himself look really good, making Tanya look really bad. And she had some counselors go to her house who were saying she was extremely anxious and strung out because of the whole situation. And, you know, despite Joe talking to the media and painting himself as this big loving husband, he had completely iced out police. He wasn't answering any questions. He was not talking to them at all. So if they wanted information, they were going to have to get it somewhere else. On the 16th of February at 10 a.m., Tanya got a visit from her brother Steve. Now, by this point, Tanya was kind of just like a shell of a human. She was severely depressed. She was anxious. She was also really worried that the police were bugging her house. She felt like everything she said and everything she did in her house was being watched and listened to. And Steve was obviously concerned about her, and he wanted to know what happened. He asked her, like, you know, I know what you've done, but what has he done? And he was trying to get answers out of her. She said he basically organized the whole thing, but other than that, she was giving really vague responses. She mainly just talked about the fact that he had brainwashed her, manipulated her, he had made her and Maria compete for each other, and I don't know, almost like realizing statements about the manipulation and control that she had been under for so long while she was with Joe. Anyway, Steve left, and it turns out that Tanya wasn't completely incorrect about being listened to, because Steve was actually wearing a wire, and while she was vague in her answers, she did make it clear that she and Joe had done something. So that afternoon, Tanya Herman was arrested for the murder of Maria Korp. On the way to the police station, she ended up breaking down and telling and confessing to the police every single thing that had happened leading up to and on the morning of the 9th of February. She said Joe pitched the idea of murdering Maria in early February, and he'd kind of played around with the idea before that, but she didn't think that he was serious until the time that he said it in early February. He basically said that the only way that they could be together was to get rid of Maria, and he had this entire plan so that they could murder Maria and get away with it. The perfect crime. He said he would obviously be the number one suspect, so he couldn't do it, so Tanya had to take the reins, and he said that she needed to strangle Maria in the garage of the Korp family house and then dispose of her body. He said that he couldn't be the one to do it because he would be the number one suspect, so Tanya had to do it, because if Tanya did it, he would have an alibi for the entire day. They'd have no reason to suspect him. He'd be at work the entire day. You know, like I said, he had 4 meetings that day. He had co-workers that saw him all day. His phone records showed that nothing was wrong. So he said that Tanya would have to strangle Maria in the garage of the Korp family home and then dispose of her body. He said that she would need to wear a pair of his shoes and gloves so that she wouldn't leave any evidence of herself in the house, no footprints that weren't from any pairs of shoes that were already in the home. And then basically after this time that he pitched it for real in early February, over the next following days, he started to really put the wheels in motion. And then the night before, on the 8th of February at 7:15 p.m, they were sitting in front of like a service station in Tanya's car, which was like right across the road from Joe's work, basically having a meeting about the murder they were going to commit the next day. And Tanya was saying how this whole time she was saying that she wouldn't be able to do it and that she didn't want to go through with it, and Joe was just reassuring her the entire time, saying, I'll be here, I'll make sure that you don't get in any trouble, it's all going to be fine, you can do it, this is the only way we can be together. And he basically said, there's no way out of this marriage, like you have to do this for me. At around 5:20 a.m. on the 9th of February, so the day that Maria was murdered, Joe pulled up out front of Tanya's house in his car, picked her up where she was in the same clothes that she met her brother in later that day, in her hoodie, her leggings, her sneakers, and Joe basically told her Maria is not to come out of that garage alive today. He had a bag for her of stuff that she needed to complete the murder, such as a swimming cap so that none of her hair could possibly fall in the crime scene. There were gloves in the bag to avoid fingerprints. There was a balaclava so that nobody would recognize her, and a meter-long thick bag strap to strangle Maria with. At around 5:50 a.m., Tanya was crouched in the corner of the Korp garage wearing Joe's shoes, the balaclava, bag strap in hand, ready for Maria to walk into the garage. And I think it's so sick because Joe was at the house and he went into the garage. He told her, you know, I love you. You have to do this. He was like pep talking her to murder his wife. While Maria was in the house, Maria had no idea. And then at 6:30 a.m., Maria walks into the garage. Tanya comes from behind, loops the bag strap around her and starts trying to strangle her. Now, Maria managed to get her hand through the bag strap and pull it away from her, and then managed to turn around and start fighting Tanya back. She pulled the balaclava off of Tanya's face and threw it to the side so she knew exactly who her attacker was. So the two women were fighting. Maria was screaming out Laura's name, her daughter's name, multiple times. So the screams that Laura heard at 6:30 a.m., which her dad convinced her were just a dream, were real. And she thought they were coming from the parents' bedroom, which, as I mentioned, was right on top of the garage. So she heard her mother being murdered in her own home and was then convinced that it was a dream. So the two women were struggling and they ended up falling against the concrete, and Maria fell face first, which is when she got those abrasions on her face, which I said were likely caused from falling on something like concrete or being pushed on something like concrete. And while she was on the ground, Tanya climbed on top of her, used the bag strap to strangle her until finally she fell unconscious. She then placed her body in the boot of her own car and drove around trying to find a place to dump the car. And she drove around for over an hour before she ended up parking the car on Dallas Brook Road. And she said that while she was driving, she heard some stirring in the boot. And she said she realized that Maria was alive and she felt guilty and she felt nauseous, but she kept driving for like another half hour after that, and then dropped off the car and never looked back. And it's like, oh, look, I know you were in a manipulative, controlling relationship, but you heard that she was still alive, said that you felt guilty, and then did nothing, dropped her body off and allowed her to sit unconscious in that boot for 102 hours. And then before she abandoned the car, she still had the sense to remove anything from it that could identify Maria, like her wallet and phone and, you know, her books. She said that while she was crossing the Princess Bridge over the Yarra River, Maria's phone started ringing, and so in a panic, she tossed it over the bridge into the river. And then a short time later is when she reached the motorcycle shop her brother worked at on Elizabeth Street and asked for a lift home. By 10 a.m., she, as I mentioned, went and visited Joe that day to drop him a sandwich off, and apparently she claims the reason she went to do this is because she was feeling really guilty about the fact that Maria, you know, maybe wasn't dead, and she was feeling really worried about that fact. And Joe then ordered her to burn any evidence of the crime, like the balaclava, the bag strap, the Maria's belongings like her wallet. So Tanya drove to Lake Epilogue, which was an old meetup spot that her and Joe used to meet at the start of their affair, and she set fire to some evidence there. And then later that night, using some bleach, Joe cleaned up Maria's blood from the garage floor at his home. And the next day, he gave Tanya another bag of items he demanded she discard for him, like, you know, his cleaning items. It also had Maria's diamond earrings in it, his running shoes that Tanya wore during the murder, which had blood stains on them, So Tanya buried the bag in an isolated area in the Green Vale Reservoir. Her full confession lasted over 4 hours, and after her confession was done, police of course went to find the evidence that she burnt and buried. At the lake where she had burnt those items, the only thing that was still left after the burning was the bag strap, or the silver pieces from the bag strap, I believe. At the Green Vale Reservoir, they also managed to dig up all of the items that she had tried to bury, like Maria's earrings, the cleaning products, and the shoes that had blood on them. They ended up setting up a crime scene at the Korp family residence, and they used chemical luminol on the concrete floor in the garage, which illuminated patches of blood that were no longer visible to the naked eye. They also collected surveillance camera footage from sources throughout the Melbourne CBD, which showed Tanya driving Maria's car on the morning of February 9th, 2005. However, Maria's phone, her necklace, and her wedding ring were never found. Jo Korp was arrested on the day of Tanya's confession and charged with conspiracy to commit an indictable offence, intentionally causing serious injury, attempted murder, as well as 4 counts of theft, and the theft charges were actually completely unrelated to Maria's attack. So if you guys remember that plastic bag that I told you about, that after Joe went to the police station, he dumped, and the police got it out and then went and searched his house. And then when they were searching his house, they found a green key card in his khaki pants. Those were all related to an unrelated theft incident at his work. The thefts had been a complete mystery to his boss and the people at his workplace. They thought obviously it was an inside job because someone needed a key card to be able to get those things. So then everybody who was in a managerial position had to hand in their green coloured master security key. However, Joe managed to pocket one of these green security keys and continue stealing, but because they didn't know that he had one of these security keys, they didn't realize it was him. And at the time that police, found this plastic bag, this green key card, they had no idea what it was. They had no idea why or if it had anything to do with Maria at all. And then turns out he'd just been stealing from his workplace this whole time. And Joe's bail ended up being set at $150,000, which he managed to pay by his parents putting up their home as collateral. And at this time, the restraining order still was in place, not allowing him to see Maria, but it also included Laura and Damien now. He wasn't allowed to have any contact with them, wasn't allowed to see them. Almost 4 months later, on the 28th of June in 2005, Maria was still fighting for her life. She had been taken out of the induced coma, but was still unresponsive. And on this day, the 28th of June, is when Tanya Herman pled guilty to attempted murder. And this guilty plea and her pledge to testify against Joe dropped 2 of her charges: conspiracy to murder and intentionally causing serious injury. So due to her cooperation with authorities, due to some psychologists saying that she was severely manipulated, that she never would have done this had she not met Joe, she was sentenced to 12 years with the possibility of parole at 9 years. The judge perceived her prospects of rehabilitation as excellent, which is why she got such a low sentence for literally murdering a woman. Joe, as you can imagine, pled not guilty to all charges, so they had to have a committal hearing for him in August to determine whether or not there was enough information or evidence to send him to trial. Steve was one of the witnesses against him. He had several points to make. He first of all said that one time at the end of December in 2004, they were watching like an episode of CSI, and Joe kind of brought up what would be the best way to get away with murder. And Steve said that he came up with the idea of strangulation with a piano wire, but then said actually maybe like a bag strap would be better. And he didn't really think anything of it because, they were watching CSI, I have spoken about what the best way to get away with murder would be, but I'm not going to murder anybody. Apparently, after New Year's, he had another conversation with Tanya in which she said that her and Joe crushed up 24 sleeping pills, gave them to Maria, but nothing happened. They just kind of made her a little bit drowsy. And Steve didn't report this because he just thought they were off comments. He thought that they were just joking, that there was nothing to be worried about. On the second day of the committal hearing is when Tanya came in to provide her evidence as a witness, and Joe's defense team tried to paint her as this, scorned mistress who acted alone, who wanted to be with Joe, but he didn't want to be with her, so she killed Maria in like an act of defiance or an act of eliminating the competition, and that Joe had nothing to do with it. Then at the end of the committal hearing, it was determined there was enough evidence for Joe to go to trial, but his bail was continued. And, you know, at around this time, Laura was also applying to have her mum's will remade, because at the time, or at this time, Joe was still the executor of her estate, and $100,000 was going to go to him. He stood to collect her half of the home and an extra $200,000 of her super and her insurance money. The court, of course, granted her application to have Joe completely off the will, so Joe would receive nothing, like he should. They were also doing some tests on Maria at this time, which were very discouraging, unfortunately. Her brain waves or brain responsiveness was lower than that of a patient under deep anesthesia. She had no brain activity, she had no fixation, she had no blink in response to threat, she had no blinks in response to stimuli, she didn't follow any commands, her muscles were withering due to inactivity, she couldn't feed herself. Her only nourishment was coming from a tube that went into her to feed her and give her hydration. She had pressure sores on her body that you get from inactivity, and her body wasn't healing them. Specialists basically concluded that Maria was in a vegetative state and she had no meaningful sense of the world. The likelihood of recovery was minute. Now, unfortunately, the person who would normally be her legal guardian and would make medical decisions for her was Joe, but because he was a suspect in her murder and there was a restraining order against him, he obviously couldn't fulfill those duties, so she had no legal guardian. And Maria's daughter Laura was also not eligible for the role. For 3 months, she had no legal guardian, her body was deteriorating, she was in a vegetative state, and nobody could make any decisions for her. The Alfred Hospital ended up applying to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal to have an independent public guardian to take the role as Maria's legal guardian to make her medical decisions. So a guardianship hearing was held in which a judge tasked public advocate Julian Gardner with the job, and he went through all the lengths to find out what Maria would want. He quizzed doctors, specialists, physicians, palliative care specialists, neurologists, Maria's friends, family, her colleagues. He even went to her church to talk with her priest to figure out all of these people's opinions on whether or not they should stop administering her food and water. And, there was a lot of public outcry about this, both for and against, because this is basically euthanasia, I suppose. Well, it is euthanasia. So there was a lot of public outcry about this, both for and against, and in the end, Julian decided it was in her best interest and she would have wanted to have the food and the water taken out, or for medical staff to stop administering her food and water, which was a very controversial decision, as I'm sure you can agree, which I'm not going to touch on too much, but all I have to say is I think that he made the right decision. I don't think there's any point in force feeding somebody who will never ever recover and is going to be in a vegetative state, and all of these medical experts have said this, and even Maria's daughter Laura also said that she didn't oppose his decision. Julian also got to decide whether or not Joe was permitted to see Maria one last time before the food and water was to stop being administered, and he decided that Maria, after reading, he read her diaries even, and he decided that after everything he had learnt about her, that she was a forgiving person and that she wanted to work things out with Joe, and so he decided to grant Joe a visitation. So on the day that the feeding tubes were removed, Joe was allowed under police supervision to visit Maria for 30 minutes, and he said a prayer for her, he kissed her forehead, rubbed her hands, and was seen leaving the hospital very distraught. And Joe, I don't think I mentioned this, was also for removing her feeding tubes, which was definitely controversial. People didn't know if it was for his own selfish reasons so that she couldn't wake up and talk, but at the same time, if the feeding tubes are removed, then his conviction can go up to a murder. So nobody really knows if it was for selfish reasons that he wanted them to be removed, or if this was his way of somehow caring about her after everything that he did to her. Anyway, in the early hours of August 5th, 2005, Maria Korp passed peacefully in her sleep. On the 12th of August, her funeral was held with more than 250 of her friends and family in attendance, which Joe watched from his own home on TV because it was televised. And that same night, just after 10 p.m, police sped towards Joe's house after getting several emergent calls. Gus Korp was waiting for them at the house, and he directed them to the large shed in the back of the property. Police ran there, the windows were blacked out, the doors were locked, they were knocking on the door saying, "Joe, can you hear me?" But there was no response besides Joe's phone ringing, going unanswered. Once they managed to gain access, they were confronted by a scene of Joe having committed suicide by hanging himself in front of a shrine of Collingwood memorabilia, empty beer cans, photos of Maria, and suicide notes. At 8:28 p.m. on the 12th of August, Joe Korp was pronounced dead. There was actually a lot of debate about this, whether or not it was an accident. Some people think that he staged it as a cry for help and that he didn't actually mean to kill himself, that the whole thing was just meant to get some attention. And on the 14th of February in 2014, 9 years and 4 days after she was put in jail for attempting to murder Maria Korp, Tanya was released from minimum security prison. And that's everything. That's the end of this case. I would really love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. And of course, as always, if you guys have any suggestions of cases you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments below. And hopefully I will see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.